I stepped out of the shopping mall, balancing 2 bags in one hand while fishing my car keys out of my purse with the other. The evening air was cool, carrying the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of people heading home from work, and the occasional honk of an impatient driver. It was an ordinary moment, a completely forgettable part of my day, until my eyes landed on a white Porsche Cayenne pulling out of the parking lot. At first, it was just an idle glance, a moment of admiration for the sleek, expensive SUV. Then my brain caught up with my eyes and my entire body tensed. The passenger window was rolled down and I saw her, Tessa. Her blonde hair was effortlessly styled, her manicured hand gesturing as she laughed at something the driver had said. A cold shiver ran down my spine as my gaze shifted to the man sitting behind the wheel. My stomach dropped. It was Brian, my husband. For a few seconds, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. I had fired Tessa a week ago. She had no job, no income, and when I last saw her, she had left my house looking completely devastated. So how the hell was she now sitting in a luxury SUV, acting like she didn't have a care in the world? And why was my husband driving her? My grip tightened around the car keys, the metal digging into my palm as the Porsche smoothly exited the parking lot, merging into the evening traffic. I forced myself to breathe, my pulse hammering in my ears. My first instinct was to chase after them, to get into my car and follow them, demanding answers. But what would I even say? I had no proof of anything, just a sickening feeling twisting in my gut, screaming that something was horribly wrong. I took out my phone, my hands trembling slightly as I typed a message to Brian. "Where are you?" A few moments later, my screen lit up with his response. "Still at the office. Gonna be a late one. Love you." I stared at the words, my mouth dry. He was lying to me. Not even a good lie, not even an excuse that required effort. He was still at the office, while I had just watched him drive off with my former housekeeper. I inhaled sharply, my mind racing. I needed to think. I needed to understand what the hell was going on. The memories of last week came rushing back. The missing earrings, the cash that disappeared from my nightstand, the growing suspicion that something wasn't right with Tessa. I had hired her 6 months ago through a cleaning agency. At first, she had been polite, efficient, even overly sweet. She always called me Mrs. Harper, despite me telling her to just call me Emma. She brought me coffee unprompted, complimented my clothes, and never forgot to ask about my day. But then little things started to happen. At first it was small, a wine glass broken and hidden in the trash, a missing lipstick that I chalked up to misplacing. Then came the earrings, a pair of diamond studs Brian had given me for our anniversary. I tore the house apart looking for them, convinced they had simply fallen behind the dresser or rolled under the bed. But they were gone, just like the cash that vanished from my purse 2 days later. The final straw came when I walked into my bedroom and found Tessa standing in front of my dresser, one of my bracelets dangling from her fingers. She had jumped at the sound of my voice, eyes wide with something between guilt and defiance. "I was just tidying up, Mrs. Harper," she had said smoothly, placing the bracelet back as if nothing had happened. I had felt the anger rise inside me like a wave. "Get out," I had said, my voice shaking. "Now." She hadn't argued, she hadn't begged or pleaded or tried to explain herself. She had simply given me one last look, a small, almost amused smirk playing on her lips before she grabbed her coat and walked out of my house. I had stood there seething, waiting for the overwhelming satisfaction that should come with catching a thief in the act. But instead, an unsettling feeling had settled in my chest, something I couldn't name at the time. And now here she was, riding around in a car that cost more than some houses, laughing like she didn't have a single problem in the world. I climbed into my own car, gripping the steering wheel as I exhaled shakily. If I had been wrong about her stealing, she would have denied it, fought back, maybe even cried. But she hadn't. She had left too easily, and now, just a week later, she was driving around with my husband. A horrible thought hit me like a freight train. What if she hadn't been stealing at all? What if I had never been the target? What if the whole time, the real plan had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with Brian? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I had ever had with Tessa, every shift in Brian's behavior over the past few months, every little moment I had dismissed as unimportant. It all felt different now, like a puzzle I had never realized I was trying to solve. The way Brian had started working late more often, the way he had been more distracted, short-tempered, the way he had started locking his phone, and now the way he had lied to me so effortlessly, not even hesitating to text me that he was still at work when I had just seen him driving Tessa. The fact that he thought I wouldn't find out, or worse, that I wouldn't care, made my stomach turn. By morning, my exhaustion was drowned out by something sharper, something burning beneath my skin. I needed answers. I wasn't going to sit back and pretend I hadn't seen what I had seen. I wasn't going to let Brian gaslight me into thinking I was imagining things. The moment he walked through the door at 7 a.m., his tie loosened, his expression carefully neutral. I knew he was going to try. "Hey, babe," he said, dropping his keys on the counter like it was any other morning. "Didn't mean to be out so late. The new project's been hell." He leaned in to kiss me, but I stepped back before he could, his brow furrowed, a flicker of annoyance passing over his face. "What's wrong?" I folded my arms, keeping my voice even. "Did you get much done at the office?" His jaw tightened, just for a second. "Yeah. Long night." I tilted my head, watching him carefully. "That's funny," I said, my pulse hammering in my ears, "because I saw you last night, driving Tessa." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching between us like a wire pulled too tight. His expression didn't change immediately, but I saw the shift, the subtle way his shoulders stiffened, the way his fingers flexed, like he was calculating his next move. Then he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Tessa? You think I was with Tessa?" "I don't think I know." I pulled out my phone, opening my camera roll, holding up the screen so he could see the grainy photo I had taken from my car. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. His hands on the wheel, Tessa laughing beside him. His face darkened, the amusement vanishing. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like I was being ridiculous. "Jesus, Emma, are you following me now? Are you cheating on me?" I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. He flinched, just barely, before his expression turned cold. "No," he said flatly, "but I see where your mind is going." I can't believe this. You see me giving someone a ride and suddenly I'm having an affair? I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let that be the truth. But it wasn't just the car ride. It wasn't just the lie. It was the way he looked at me now, like I was an inconvenience, like I was the problem. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Then why did you lie?" His jaw tightened again. "Because I knew you'd react like this. I didn't want to deal with this exact conversation. You've always been suspicious of Tessa. And I didn't feel like getting into it." "You didn't feel like getting into it," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "So instead of just telling me the truth, you made me think I was crazy." He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling sharply. "She called me last night, said she was having car trouble, needed a ride home. I was already on my way out of the office, so I helped her out. That's it. End of story." It sounded rehearsed. Too clean, too convenient. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then why didn't she just call an Uber? Why you? He threw up his hands. "I don't know, Emma. Maybe because she knows me, and she thought I'd do her a favor. Or maybe because she didn't want to deal with some stranger. Jesus, do you hear yourself?" I did, and I heard him too, and it was all bullshit. But I let it drop. I nodded slowly, pressing my lips together like I was considering his words. "Okay," I said quietly. "Fine." Relief flickered across his face. "Okay, good. Can we move on now?" I nodded again, stepping away. "Yeah, I just need some air." I grabbed my keys and walked out the front door before he could say anything else, before he could convince me that this was all in my head, because I knew, deep down, that it wasn't. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. Tessa had called him. Tessa had needed a ride. Tessa had somehow gone from an unemployed housekeeper to a woman riding around in a Porsche in less than a week. I needed to know how. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving before I could overthink it, searching her name on social media. Her profiles were private, of course, but her tagged photos weren't. I scrolled through picture after picture, selfies with friends, pictures of cocktails at rooftop bars, the occasional blurry group shot at a club. And then I saw it. A photo posted just 2 days ago. Tessa, sitting in the passenger seat of the same white Porsche, a glass of champagne in one hand, her other hand resting on the knee of the man beside her, a man who wasn't Brian. My pulse spiked. I clicked the profile of the man who had posted it. His name was Daniel Cole. His bio was vague, something about private investments and a string of hashtags that screamed old money. I scrolled through his photos, my breath catching in my throat. Tessa was in several of them, in different outfits, at different locations, always with the same smug, carefree expression. This wasn't just some random favor. This wasn't just Brian being nice. Tessa was involved with someone powerful, and somehow Brian was tangled up in it. I exhaled slowly, gripping my phone tighter. If I wanted to find out the truth, I needed to go to the source. I needed to talk to Tessa. I sat in my car outside the cafe, watching the entrance with my heart pounding in my chest. It had taken me 2 days to track down Tessa. 2 days of scrolling through tagged photos, watching locations, looking for patterns in her posts. She was careless, or maybe just arrogant. She went to the same places over and over again. High-end bars, exclusive lounges, restaurants where people like her weren't supposed to afford a table. And now she was here, sitting inside a quiet, upscale cafe that catered to the kind of people who didn't blink at spending $20 on a cup of coffee. I had no plan, no strategy beyond getting her to talk. But I needed answers, and she was the only one who could give them to me. I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and stepped out of the car. The bell over the door jingled as I walked in, and for a second I thought she might not see me. She was sitting at a table by the window, casually sipping her latte, scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered by the world around her. But then, as if she had sensed me before she even looked up, her eyes lifted from the screen and met mine, and she smiled. Not a startled smile, not the nervous smile of someone who had been caught. No, it was slow and deliberate, as if she had been expecting me, as if she knew I would come looking. My stomach twisted, but I didn't let it show. I walked over, pulling out the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. She tilted her head slightly, amused, but didn't say a word. I placed my hands on the table, steadying myself. "You got fired a week ago," I said, my voice calm but firm, "and now you're driving around in luxury cars, drinking $30 lattes, and living like you've hit the jackpot. So tell me, Tessa, how exactly did that happen?" She let out a soft chuckle, setting her phone down. "You always did have a sharp eye, Mrs. Harper," she said smoothly. "I guess I should have expected you to come sniffing around eventually." My jaw tightened. "Don't act like you knew this was coming." "Oh, but I did," she said, tilting her head. "You're the type who can't let things go. You couldn't let it go when your earrings went missing, couldn't let it go when your money disappeared. You couldn't even let it go when I walked out of your house without begging for a second chance." She stirred her coffee lazily, like we were just two old friends catching up. "So no, this doesn't surprise me at all." I ignored the way my pulse jumped at her words. "Then you won't be surprised that I want answers." Tessa sighed dramatically, leaning back in her chair. "And what exactly do you think I'm going to tell you? That I stole from you? That I ran off with your husband? That I had some grand master plan to ruin your life?" She smirked. "Sorry to disappoint, but life isn't some dramatic soap opera, Emma." My breath caught slightly at the way she said my name, dropping the formalities she had always used before. It felt deliberate, a shift in power. I narrowed my eyes. "Then explain it. Explain why you were in that car with my husband. Explain why you're suddenly living like a woman who doesn't have to worry about money." For the first time, something flickered across her face. Annoyance, maybe, or boredom. She took another sip of her coffee before setting the cup down with a quiet clink. "Fine," she said. "You want the truth? Here it is. Your husband has problems, Emma, and I'm not talking about the works too late and forgets anniversaries kind. I mean real problems, money problems." My fingers curled into fists under the table. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that get you in deep with people you don't want to owe favors to," she said, watching me closely. "The kind that make you desperate. The kind that make you do stupid things." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my expression neutral. "What does that have to do with you?" Tessa gave me another one of those infuriating smirks. I'm just the messenger, the middleman, the girl who was in the right place at the right time." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "And lucky for me, Brian was exactly the type of man they love doing business with, arrogant, reckless, and just desperate enough to think he can talk his way out of anything. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Who are they? Her smile didn't waver. You don't want to know. I leaned forward now, matching her intensity. You don't get to decide what I want to know. Tessa studied me for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. You really don't know, do you? She shook her head, almost pitying. Your husband's been playing a very dangerous game, Emma, and whether you like it or not, you're a part of it now. The words sent a shiver down my spine, but I refused to let her see it. I don't believe you. She shrugged. That's your problem, not mine. She grabbed her purse and stood up, brushing imaginary dust from her perfectly pressed blouse. But I'll give you a little free advice. Stop asking questions, because the people Brian owes, they don't like loose ends. And trust me, Emma, right now, that's exactly what you are. I watched her walk out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. She thought she had won. She thought I would be too scared to dig any deeper. But if she really knew me like she claimed, she would have known one thing. When someone tells me to stop asking questions, it only makes me want to ask more. I pulled out my phone, my hand steadier than I expected. If Brian was in trouble, if he had gotten himself caught up in something dangerous, then I needed to find out just how deep he had sunk. And there was only one way to do that. I was going to follow the money. I sat in my car outside the cafe long after Tessa had gone, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Her words kept replaying in my head, twisting like a knife. Your husband has problems, real problems, and whether you like it or not, you're a part of it now. She had spoken with such confidence, like she knew something I didn't, like she had already decided how this would all end, but she was wrong about one thing. I wasn't a loose end. I wasn't some naive wife who would just back down and pretend everything was fine. I had spent years building a life with Brian, and if there were secrets hidden in that life, I was going to dig them up myself. I pulled out my phone and opened Brian's banking app. The login credentials burned into my memory from years of managing our finances. The moment I signed in, a sick feeling coiled in my stomach. The numbers didn't add up. Our savings account, which had held over $70,000 just 3 months ago, was nearly drained. Only a little over $5,000 remained. But that wasn't even the worst part. The checking account showed multiple large withdrawals over the past few weeks. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, all taken out in cash. I scrolled further, my pulse hammering. A pattern began to emerge. The money wasn't just disappearing randomly. The withdrawals happened in clusters, always a few days apart, always in even amounts, like scheduled payments. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A transaction from 2 months ago. $25,000 wired to a name I didn't recognize. DC Holdings. Tessa's voice echoed in my head. Your husband's been playing a very dangerous game. I copied the transaction details, then switched to a private browser on my phone and searched DC Holdings. The results were vague, almost too vague, like someone had scrubbed them clean. No website, no official business listing, just a few scattered mentions on obscure financial forums, but one link caught my attention. A thread on a business dispute forum where someone had posted a warning about a private lender using the name DC Holdings to cover illegal activity. I clicked on it, my stomach twisting tighter. If you're dealing with DC Holdings, run. They don't do contracts, they don't do negotiations, and they sure as hell don't do refunds. They loan fast money to desperate people, but the interest is brutal, and if you can't pay, they don't just take you to court, they take everything. Your business, your house, your family, whatever they want. I've seen guys disappear over debts smaller than 50 grand. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. Brian owed money to criminals, not banks, not investors, criminals. A cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck as I thought back to the changes in him over the past few months. The stress, the late nights, the sudden bursts of anger whenever I asked about our finances. I had assumed he was just overwhelmed with work, but now I saw it for what it really was. Fear. He was in deep and he knew it, and instead of telling me, instead of asking for help, he had lied. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think logically. If Brian had been making payments, that meant he wasn't completely out of options yet. But the money in our account was almost gone, and if these people didn't get what they were owed, what would they do next? I needed more information, and I knew exactly where to start. I went home and waited for Brian to return. When he walked in that evening, looking exhausted and distracted, I played it carefully. I pretended everything was normal. I smiled, I made dinner, I asked about his day like nothing had changed. And when we sat down to eat, I casually brought up money. I was thinking we should move some funds back into the savings account, I said, keeping my tone light. It's looking a little low. Brian barely glanced up from his plate. Yeah, I'll take care of it. I stabbed at my salad. Actually, I was looking at the accounts today. I saw his shoulders stiffen just slightly, the pause in his movement almost imperceptible. We've been making a lot of big withdrawals lately. His fork clinked against his plate. What were you doing looking at the accounts? That reaction alone told me everything. He didn't ask what I saw. He didn't ask if something looked off. His first instinct was defense. I was just checking on things, I said carefully. It's not a crime, is it? He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. No, of course not. I've been handling some investments, moving things around. Investments, I repeated, tilting my head. Like the one with DC Holdings? The color drained from his face so fast that for a second I thought he might actually pass out. His fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against the plate as he stared at me. His expression shifted from shock to anger in a heartbeat. Where did you hear that name? I held his gaze. I saw the transfers. I looked them up. And I know they're not just some investment firm. His hands clenched into fists on the table. Emma, you don't understand. Then explain it to me, I snapped. Explain why you drained our savings and lied to me about it. Explain why my former housekeeper knows more about our finances than I do. Explain why you're involved with criminals who make people disappear over debts. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. For the first time, I saw real panic in his eyes. I didn't have a choice, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a bad deal. I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know. My stomach twisted. How much do you owe them? Brian exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. 200,000? The air left my lungs. Jesus Christ. He looked at me, desperate now. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. At first I borrowed 50, thinking I could flip it in a deal. But the interest. Emma, they don't do normal interest rates. Every time I thought I was making progress, the number just kept going up. I shook my head, trying to process. And Tessa? Where does she fit into this? Brian hesitated. She's connected to them. A horrible realization settled over me. She wasn't stealing from us, was she? Brian's silence was my answer. My pulse pounded in my ears. I had fired Tessa for something she hadn't even done. She hadn't been looking through my things to steal. She had been looking for something valuable to them, and now she was flaunting her new life, acting like she was untouchable. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor. I need to fix this. Brian's eyes widened. Emma, no, you need to stay out of this. But it was too late. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. I was done being kept in the dark. It was time to talk to someone who actually had power in this game. It was time to meet Daniel Cole. I found myself sitting outside an upscale rooftop lounge, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, casting a cold glow over the polished black cars lined up along the curb. It was the kind of place where men like Daniel Cole conducted their business, not in boardrooms but in dimly lit corners over expensive whiskey, where a handshake could mean the difference between wealth and ruin. I had no invitation, no appointment, but I wasn't leaving without answers. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car, smoothed down my blouse, and strode toward the entrance. The bouncer barely looked at me before shaking his head. Private event. I didn't hesitate. I'm here for Daniel Cole. That got his attention. His gaze flicked over me, assessing, deciding if I was worth the trouble. I met his stare without flinching. After a long moment, he exhaled through his nose and jerked his head toward the door. Upstairs. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of aged liquor. The lounge was buzzing with low conversation, laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes of the men who sat in plush leather chairs, their movements controlled, their postures exuding power. And there, in the center of it all, was Daniel Cole. He sat at a corner table, relaxed but undeniably in control, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, his other arm draped casually over the back of the booth. Tessa was beside him, leaning in close, whispering something that made him smirk. My pulse pounded as I walked straight toward them. Tessa saw me first. Her expression didn't shift. No surprise, no panic, just a slow, amused smile. "Mrs. Harper," she purred. "Didn't expect to see you here." Daniel glanced at me, uninterested at first, then more curious as he took in my tense posture, the way I didn't hesitate to slide into the seat across from him. He tilted his head, studying me like I was something unexpected but not entirely unwelcome. "And you are?" I forced my voice to stay steady. "Emma Harper." He chuckled. "Well, Emma Harper, I don't usually take meetings without notice. I don't usually force my way into them," I countered. "But I think we have a problem that needs solving." He raised a brow, intrigued. "Do we?" I exhaled slowly. "I know about the money. The loans. I know Brian owes you $200,000. I know you don't exactly handle unpaid debts through legal channels. And I know Tessa's been keeping tabs on us long before I realized it." At that, his gaze flicked toward Tessa. She just shrugged, unconcerned. "Told you she was smart." Daniel smiled at that, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down your spine. The kind that made it clear he was in control, no matter what I thought I was doing. "You're well informed," he admitted, "but that doesn't change the fact that your husband made a deal, and now he has to pay up." I swallowed my fear. "What if I can get you your money another way?" That got his attention. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers steepled. "I'm listening." I kept my voice level. "I looked into your business. DC Holdings is a front, but your real operation is risk management. You don't just lend money, you collect favors, leverage. You're always looking for ways to expand your influence." His expression didn't change, but I knew I was right. I took a steady breath. "I have something better than money. I have access." Daniel let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Access to what exactly?" I leaned in. "Brian's company handles corporate accounts worth millions. He's desperate, which means he's stupid. If you need a way into places that won't do business with you, I can get you that." A flicker of interest crossed his face. He glanced at Tessa, who gave a slow nod. He exhaled, swirling his drink before setting it down. "That's a compelling offer, Mrs. Harper, but it still doesn't erase the debt." "I'm not asking you to erase it," I said. "I'm asking for time. Give me a week. Let me put something together. If I fail, then you get what you want however you see fit. But if I succeed, you get something better than a payout." Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, Daniel smiled. "A week." He held up a finger. "No more." I nodded, ignoring the knot in my stomach. "Deal." I stood up, forcing my legs not to shake as I turned and walked away. I could feel their eyes on me, Daniel's interest, Tessa's amusement. I had bought us time, but now I had to figure out how the hell I was going to use it. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The city lights blurred outside the window, neon streaks against the dark, but my mind was far from the road. 1 week, that was all I had. 1 week to come up with something big enough, valuable enough, to keep Daniel Cole from destroying Brian. And by extension, me. I had walked into that lounge prepared to negotiate, but now the weight of what I had promised pressed against my chest like a vice. I had offered him access, influence, but I had no idea how I was going to deliver. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Brian was home. I could see the faint glow of the television through the living room curtains, but he hadn't waited up. I walked inside, locking the door behind me, and found him slouched on the couch, half asleep, an empty whiskey glass on the coffee table. He blinked groggily as I stepped closer, rubbing his eyes before registering the look on my face. "Where were you?" His voice was hoarse, laced with exhaustion, but there was something else beneath it. Suspicion. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked up his empty glass and turned it in my hands. I met with Daniel Cole. That woke him up completely. Brian sat up so fast the couch creaked beneath him. "You did what?" I set the glass down with a quiet clink. "I made a deal." His face paled. "Emma? I bought you a week," I cut him off. "1 week to fix this. To find a way out." Brian ran a shaking hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have done that." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Well, someone had to." I crossed my arms, watching him. "Unless you had a better plan? Were you just going to wait until they came knocking? Hope they'd be generous and give you more time?" His jaw tightened. "You don't understand how dangerous these people are." "No, Brian," I snapped. "You don't understand. You lied to me. For months. You put us both in danger, and you didn't even have the decency to warn me, so don't you dare sit there and tell me what I should or shouldn't have done." He looked away, shame flickering across his face. But shame wasn't enough. Regret wasn't enough. I needed him to be useful. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to steady. "Tell me everything. Every deal you made, every payment, every person you talked to. I need to know exactly what we're up against." For a moment, I thought he was going to refuse, but then he sighed, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It started small," he admitted. "I was short on cash for an investment and the banks weren't an option. DC Holdings was different. No paperwork, no questions, just fast money." He rubbed his hands together as if trying to rid himself of something filthy. "I thought I could turn it around quickly, pay them back before it became a problem, but the interest, it wasn't normal. Every week the debt grew. No matter how much I paid, it was never enough." I swallowed hard. "And Tessa?" Brian exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "She wasn't a housekeeper, Emma. Not really. She was watching us. Watching me. Making sure I didn't run." He let out a bitter laugh. "Hell, for all I know, she was waiting for me to slip up so they'd have an excuse to take more." My stomach churned, but I didn't let the nausea show. "And now?" Brian met my gaze, his eyes hollow. "Now they own me. If I don't pay, they'll take everything. The house, the business, maybe more." I nodded slowly, letting the reality of the situation settle in. Then I turned, heading for my office. "Where are you going?" Brian called after me. "To figure out how to beat them." I spent the next several hours going through everything, bank statements, business records, anything that might give me leverage. But it wasn't until I hacked into Brian's work email that I found something useful. A series of encrypted messages, buried beneath routine correspondence, all tied to a shell company I didn't recognize. And the more I dug, the worse it got. Brian wasn't just in debt, he was a pawn in something much larger. DC Holdings wasn't just lending money, they were laundering it. Filtering illegal cash through businesses like Brian's, using desperate men like him to keep it clean, and if that ever came to light, if the wrong people found out, it wouldn't just be Brian in danger, it would be Cole. I leaned back in my chair, my pulse racing. That was it. That was my leverage. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, I had everything I needed. Evidence, a strategy, a way out. But it all hinged on one thing, getting Daniel Cole to believe that I was more valuable as an ally than as a debt to be collected. And for that, I needed to meet him again, on my terms. I arrived at the lounge just after 10, the weight of my plan pressing against my ribs like a steel cage. The city pulsed around me, neon signs casting sharp reflections against the rain-slicked pavement, the distant hum of sirens blending into the bass that throbbed from behind the club's velvet-curtained entrance. I wasn't afraid, not anymore. Fear had been replaced by something colder, sharper, the kind of clarity that came when there were no more choices left. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. I spotted Daniel Cole in his usual corner, Tessa draped over his side like an expensive accessory. Her gaze flickered toward me the second I entered, but this time, I saw something different in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe even a little respect. She had expected me to walk away. I hadn't. Daniel noticed me a moment later. A slow smirk tugged at his lips as he gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Mrs. Harper," he drawled, amusement lacing his voice. Back so soon? I slid into the seat without hesitation, setting my phone down on the table between us. I have something you're going to want. He chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Do you now? I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough that only he could hear. I know what you're doing. The loans, the businesses, the shell companies. I know you're not just lending money, you're washing it. I tapped my phone lightly. And I have the proof. The amusement drained from his face so quickly that for the first time, I saw what lay beneath the charm, something dangerous. His fingers tightened around his glass, his jaw twitching. That's a bold accusation. I didn't blink. It's not an accusation, it's a fact. Silence stretched between us, a test, a moment where everything balanced on the edge of a blade. I didn't look away, I didn't let my hands shake, and then, just like that, he smiled again. You've done your homework, he admitted, sitting back. Impressive. But tell me, Mrs. Harper, what exactly do you plan to do with this information? I exhaled slowly, forcing my pulse to steady. I don't want trouble. I want a deal. Brian's debt is wiped clean. You let us walk away. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. And why the hell would I do that? Because if something happens to me or Brian, or even if you so much as breathe in our direction again, that proof gets sent to the FBI, to the IRS, to every agency that would love to dig into your business. I tapped my phone again. And before you think about trying to erase it, know that I've already backed it up in places you can't reach. Tessa let out a low whistle beside him. Damn, she murmured. Didn't think you had it in you. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just studied me, weighing the risks, calculating the odds. Then, finally, he let out a slow exhale, setting his glass down with a quiet clink. You've got nerve, Mrs. Harper, he said, almost admiringly. Fine, the debt is gone, but understand this. If you ever interfere in my business again, no amount of backup files will save you. I nodded once, understood. I stood up, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Tessa watched me with something that almost resembled amusement, but she didn't say a word. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding, the cold night air rushing against my skin as I stepped onto the street. It was over. Brian and I were free. But as I got into my car, gripping the steering wheel, I realized something. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that lounge a week ago, desperate and blind. I had learned something about myself in all of this. Something that scared me more than any threat Daniel Cole could ever make. I liked the game, and for the first time in my life, I knew I could win it.